So if you want to checkmate the IRS, then you need to be using a 508c1A trust, otherwise known as the private common law irrevocable ecclesiastical trust. So in terms of arriving at that conclusion, the first thing you have to understand when you're dealing with the IRS is that taxes are a game. Just like the game of business. When you're dealing with a 10,000 page thick stack of rules, what are these rules for? These rules are for the tax game. So that's why I like to have the analogy comparing taxes to chess, because chess also is a game. And you see many of these cliche chess analogies in movies and books, and most of the time they're quite horrible in how they're presented and not nuanced at all. So I grew up playing chess. I was at one point a co-national champion, and I grew up playing with many of the top grandmasters in the world. And that's how I first got introduced to the world of finance, was through chess, because there was a billionaire hedge fund manager in New York City who would sponsor these invitational private tournaments. Grandmasters, some of the top players in the world, like Garry Kasparov, would come and teach. And when you look at how grandmasters play chess, obviously, you hear these sayings about thinking 10 moves ahead, however many moves ahead. But it's not just about thinking in a linear pattern as far as you can out into the future. It's also about looking laterally. So what kind of moves do you have at your disposal right now? And there's so many different variations that you could choose. And part of what separates a grandmaster from lower ranked players is grandmasters see the most important patterns on the board. I mean, there are literally billions of potential combinations, and you have to have the level of foresight and insight into the nuances of the game to understand which are the relevant patterns going forward in this exact moment in time that you need to be aware of and looking for, and then calculating ahead. So when it comes to dealing with taxes, every time you talk to a lawyer or an accountant, it's always reactive. It's always procedural. So, we're going to try to write off this G-Wagon and do this 1031 exchange and this cost segregation study and this and this and this to react to 10,000 pages of, indecipherable garbage that, again, you're paying so much money for these so-called experts to interpret this. But here's the really simple and easy solution, ultimately. It's realizing that when you're looking at this game, there's a way to actually opt out, so to speak. And when you look at the cliche sayings in the Matrix, there's an exception to every rule. Well, the same thing goes for taxes. We hear public stories about these billionaires and these politicians and all kinds of different people who clearly are not paying any taxes. Now, there are different mechanisms on how you do that. And, I've seen incredibly complicated strategies to avoid paying taxes. There was this crypto guy I talked to in my building recently who paid $100,000 to set up a system of offshore trusts in order to, avoid paying taxes. And I'm not even sure if it completely avoided all taxes, but it hopefully did something, because the guy paid $100,000 for it. So, you see these kind of really expensive schemes, and then you see lesser schemes that are less expensive but require a lot of effort, meaning you have to write off this and come up with these new lists of write-offs every year and have all these tax planning meetings. And it's just exhausting. And then once you do that, guess what? You got the incredible, lucky job of doing it all over again. So that's not exactly the answer we're looking for either. Once we start to get into trust law, in particular private trust law, that's where it gets interesting. Because when we start to look at how the matrix was constructed, right? How was the US government built? What documents actually built the US government? Let's start there. So there was a Declaration of Independence plus an Articles of Confederation. When you have a declaration plus an articles, what do you have? You have a trust. So the United States government was built as a trust. They stamped it across the back of every dollar bill. In God we trust. That's the name of an actual trust. And so when we realize that the government uses trusts, there has to be a way for sovereign entities to do business with each other in a way that's secure and where they don't pay taxes. And that is the world of private irrevocable trusts. It's one of our constitutional God-given rights for us to be able to have the knowledge and the insight to be able to write our own trust. And then we can take this trust out and we can use it in the world to conduct commerce and business affairs. Most people, when they're conducting their business affairs, when they're buying things day to day, paying for where they're going to live, doing all these things, they're doing it in their social security number, in their personal name, which was issued to you by the government. And some people who are a little smarter, maybe you'll use an LLC or an S Corp or a C Corp. But once again, these entities are all created by the government. So they impose their own arbitrary rules, really heavy taxation. And again, you got to go by their 10,000-page rulebook. But once you create your own private trust, the government didn't create it. So all of a sudden, you start to fall under a different set of rules. And so the main overarching rule that you fall under is Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which is the right to contract. And the trusts that we use are private trust contracts. And private trusts are a contract written, as far as how they're defined in Black's Law Dictionary. The trust is simply a contract with three different parties. You have a grantor or settler, you have the trustees, and then you have the beneficiaries. And so the grantor or the settler, they grant the initial assets to the trustees, who are trusted to look after those assets on behalf of a beneficiary or group of beneficiaries. So this is a private contract under private constitutional contract law. And there is a long precedent of the Supreme Court standing behind these trusts and having them be completely bulletproof in court, immune to legal liability, immune to eminent domain. You could put assets in here and potentially even stop foreclosure. I mean, the power of this trust is incredible. And then when you add in other systems of businesses and different types of policies to create a private family banking system, that's one of the core strategies that many billionaire families use. And then you can also just do normal other sorts of real estate or stocks, crypto, whatever you want. And again, it's all untaxed and all growing, compounding in your private system. So this is how you checkmate the IRS. It's one simple move where you realize, all these rules here, this is just obfuscation. This is distraction. And the real way to cut through all of that is one simple line in the IRS code, which is 508C1A. That's it. And look, there are other ways to do it. If you want to pay $100,000, go ahead, do it that way. I also paid personally $20,000 for another trust that used another section of the code, which was more complex and had more sort of upkeep in order to qualify for that section. But there was that way to do it. Then you can do it the way of write-offs. That's what most accountants and most so-called lawyers, tax lawyers will tell you to do. They'll tell you to just write off stuff every year. Let's come up with 100 different write-offs and let's cross our fingers and pray the IRS doesn't audit us. But when you start using irrevocable trusts, the rate of the IRS auditing irrevocable trusts is nearly zero. Nearly zero. And the rare examples that they are, I don't even want to mention them, because usually it's when you have an irrevocable trust that owns some kind of legislative entity. So like it has a deal with an LLC, and then it was structured incorrectly with the LLC. And that's where I've seen people get caught. But I mean, private irrevocable trusts, these things are never audited because the IRS just stays away from it. With their $5 billion in funding and their fancy AI and their 80,000 new agents, who are they going to go after? They're going to go after the lowly peasants who went on LegalZoom and set up their LLC. And then next, they're going to go after, again, all the S Corps, C Corps, LLCs, whatever, all the legislative entities that they have control over within their jurisdiction. Once we step out of the public realm and into the private realm, that's where things start to get really interesting. So, don't fall for all the lines of thinking with all these kind of complex mechanisms. And these are all distractions. People feel like such a sense of accomplishment where they're like, yeah, I just got a $10 million tax write-off. But guess what? You didn't owe any taxes in the first place.